You had no right to go through my private emails. Mark saw this coming. He told me you were always looking for ways to sabotage what we were building. That money was supposed to secure our future, but you couldn't just trust the process like a normal wife would. If you breathe a word of this to anyone at your office, I'll make sure HR hears every detail about how unstable you've been lately. Sign the separation agreement tomorrow and we both walk away clean, or don't, and watch how fast everything you care about disappears. Hi, my name is Jessica Carter. I am 33 years old. The words landed like ice water down my back. I stood in our kitchen, phone still in my hand from when I'd forwarded the first email to myself, and stared at my husband Ryan. His face was the same one I'd woken up next to for 6 years, but the voice coming out of it belonged to a stranger who had already decided I was the problem. I didn't yell. I didn't cry right then. I just asked him very quietly what Mark had to do with our joint savings account and why a random coworker suddenly had opinions about our marriage. Ryan laughed once short and ugly and told me Mark was the only person who understood what it took to get ahead in this economy. Then he walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the framed photo of our 10th anniversary trip, the one we never actually took because the money had disappeared into his business opportunity. That was the moment the floor tilted. Everything I thought I knew about the man I married started sliding sideways. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in 3 years. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and started pulling every statement I could find. The joint checking account we had opened when we bought the townhouse showed transfers I didn't recognize, amounts that matched the exact figure we had been saving for a down payment on a bigger place. The same day, Ryan told me the market was too hot and we should wait. Every transfer went to an account I had never seen before. The memo lines were blank or labeled consulting fees. I spent the whole day cross-referencing dates. The biggest withdrawal had happened 2 days after Ryan came home late and told me his coworker Mark needed help launching a side project. He had asked me to co-sign a small personal loan just to get things off the ground. I had said yes because he promised it would be paid back in 6 months and we would finally have the cushion we needed to start trying for a baby. That was the future he had painted for me in careful, loving detail for almost a year. By late afternoon, my hands were shaking so hard I had to close the laptop. I called my friend Megan Brooks, the only person I trusted, not to tell me I was overreacting. She came over with coffee and sat across from me while I showed her the statements. Megan didn't say I told you so. She just looked at the numbers and said, Jess, this isn't normal. You need to talk to someone who knows what these transfers actually mean. That night, Ryan came home after 10. He smelled like the cologne he only wore when he had client dinners. I asked him straight out where the money had gone. He didn't even blink. He said Mark's startup was going to change everything for us and that I was being selfish for questioning it. When I told him I had seen the emails, the ones where he and Mark discussed keeping her in the dark until the funding clears, his expression changed. The mask slipped for half a second. Then he smiled the cold, sarcastic smile I was starting to recognize and told me I was welcome to leave if I couldn't handle being part of a real team. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to him breathe like nothing had happened, and realized the promised future had never been a plan. It had been a story he told to keep me signing documents and staying quiet. The next morning, I called in sick again and drove to the bank. I sat with a manager named Linda Shaw and asked for every document tied to our accounts and the loan I had co-signed. Linda was professional and careful. She printed everything. When she handed me the stack, one page made my stomach drop. It was a medical history form that had been submitted with the loan application. My name was on it. The form claimed I had a chronic condition that made me unable to work full-time, which had apparently helped qualify us for a higher loan amount. I had never seen that form. I had never been diagnosed with anything like that. Linda looked at my face and asked if I wanted to file a fraud report. I told her I needed to think. I drove straight to Megan's apartment instead. She made me eat something while I showed her the altered medical records. We both sat in silence for a long minute. Then Megan said the words I hadn't let myself form yet. You need a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer yet. A lawyer who understands financial fraud. I found Thomas Hale through a recommendation from a woman at work who had been through something similar. He was calm and expensive and didn't waste time on sympathy. I brought him every statement, every email I had forwarded to myself, and the medical form. He read for 20 minutes without speaking. When he finally looked up, he said, "They used your identity and falsified medical information to secure funds. That's not just a marital issue, that's potential wire fraud and identity theft. The fact that a coworker is involved makes it a conspiracy." I left his office with my head buzzing. The world felt both sharper and farther away at the same time. I went home, packed a bag, and left a note on the kitchen counter telling Ryan I was staying with a friend until we could talk like adults. I didn't mention the lawyer. I didn't mention the medical form. I just wrote that I needed space. He texted me 6 times that night. The messages started reasonable and turned vicious by the fourth one. He called me paranoid, dramatic, and ungrateful for everything he had provided. The last text said Mark had been right about me all along. I didn't reply to any of them. 2 days later, I got an email from Ryan's work address. It was a forwarded thread between him and Mark. The subject line was damage control reject. In the emails, they discussed how to handle me if I started asking questions. Mark suggested painting me as emotionally unstable at work. Ryan replied that he already had the medical angle ready if it came to that. The altered form suddenly made horrible sense. They had planned for me to look unstable or sick, so no one would believe me if I spoke up. I forwarded the entire thread to Thomas Hale. He called me within the hour and told me to come in immediately. When I sat down across from him, he said the words that changed everything. "We have enough for a restraining order and a civil suit. If you want to go criminal, we can talk to the FBI about the interstate wire transfers and the falsified medical information. Your call." I sat there holding the printed emails and realized I was shaking. Not from fear, from the cold, bitter clarity that the man I had built a life with had been constructing my destruction with his co-worker for months. The promised future had never existed. It was a story used to keep me compliant while they drained the accounts and set me up to take the fall. I looked at Thomas and said, "I want them to understand exactly what they did, and then I want to walk away." He nodded once like he had been waiting for that answer. "Then we start building the case, and you start building the life you actually want." I walked out of his office into the bright afternoon and realized my hands had finally stopped shaking. The betrayal was still there, massive and ugly, but for the first time it didn't feel like it was happening to me. It felt like something I was finally allowed to see clearly and refuse to carry anymore. The next morning I showed up at work anyway. I wasn't going to give my husband or his co-worker the satisfaction of watching me hide. I kept my head down, answered emails, and tried to pretend the stack of papers from Thomas Hale wasn't burning a hole in my bag. Around 10, my colleague Karen Ellis stopped by my desk with 2 coffees and the kind of look that said she already knew something was off. She didn't pry at first, she just slid 1 cup over and said, "You look like you fought a war last night. Want to talk or want me to run interference if anyone asks why you called in yesterday?" I gave her the shortest version I could manage without crying or screaming. Karen listened, then muttered something under her breath about men who treat their wives like backup plans. She offered to sit in on any meeting if things got weird. I told her I hoped it wouldn't come to that. It came to that by lunch. My phone lit up with a forwarded email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was blank. Inside was a chain that started with my husband and Mark discussing the J situation and escalated into Mark suggesting they leak the altered medical form to my HR department if I kept pushing. He wrote, "She'll look unstable. Perfect for the narrative we need." My husband had replied with a thumbs up emoji and a note about how the loan was already approved, so they just needed to keep me quiet until the funds cleared. I read it twice, then I forwarded it straight to Thomas Hale with shaking fingers and told Karen I needed 5 minutes. She didn't ask questions, she just nodded and said she'd cover for me if anyone came looking. By the time I reached the break room, my hands were ice cold. I called Thomas from the hallway. He answered on the first ring and told me to forward everything immediately and not to reply to any messages from my husband or Mark. This just moved from civil to potential criminal, he said. The medical falsification plus the intent to use it against you at work is leverage we can use. But you need to stay calm and document it. Calm was not on the menu. I hung up and walked back to my desk just in time to see another email hit my inbox, this one from Mark's work address, not even trying to hide. It was addressed to me, my husband, and copied to 3 people in my own company's HR. The body was short and vicious. Jessica Ryan asked me to reach out since you're having trouble communicating like an adult. The medical documentation we submitted was to protect you. If you keep making accusations, we'll have no choice but to clarify the situation with your employer. Let's resolve this privately before it gets ugly. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Karen appeared at my shoulder without me noticing. She read over my arm and let out a low, angry sound. They're trying to get you fired or put on leave, she said. This is harassment. You need to report this right now. Before I could answer, my desk phone rang. It was HR. They wanted me in a meeting in 20 minutes. Karen squeezed my shoulder once and said, I'm coming with you. You're not walking in there alone. The meeting was exactly as bad as I expected. And somehow worse. The HR director, a woman I had only met once at a company picnic, sat with printed copies of the emails Mark had sent. She asked me very carefully about my health status and whether there was anything I needed to disclose that might affect my performance. I told her the medical form was falsified without my knowledge. She nodded like she was humoring me and said they would look into it. Then she asked if I would consider taking a short leave while things were sorted out. Karen spoke up before I could answer. She pointed out that the emails constituted a clear attempt to interfere with my employment and that I had already consulted legal counsel. The HR director's face tightened, but she agreed to document everything and said they would follow up. I walked out of that meeting with my job technically intact, but my reputation suddenly in question. People in the hallway were already glancing at me sideways. The rumor mill had started turning before I even reached the elevator. When I got back to Megan's apartment that evening, I was vibrating with a mix of rage and exhaustion. Megan made me eat half a sandwich while I showed her the new emails. She read them and then looked at me with the same sharp anger I felt. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore, she said. This Mark guy is helping your husband set you up to look crazy. You can't let them control the story. I told her about the lawyer and the plan to gather more documentation. Megan nodded, then said something that stopped me cold. What if we don't wait for them to leak more? What if we control the leak ourselves? You have the originals. Send them to the right people before they twist it further. I almost laughed. The bitter, sarcastic part of me wanted to burn it all down right then, forward every email to the entire company, to Ryan's boss, to Mark's wife if he had one. But the part of me that had survived this long knew that kind of move would make me look exactly as unstable as they were trying to paint me. I needed to be smarter, colder, documented. I called Thomas again. He listened to the latest developments and told me to come in first thing in the morning with everything. We're building a protective order and a demand letter, he said. And I want to bring in a forensic person to trace every transfer. This is no longer just about your marriage. It's about what they did with your name and your credit. That night, I lay on Megan's couch, staring at the ceiling and replaying every promise my husband had ever made about our future. The house with the yard, the baby we would try for once the finances were stable, the vacations we would take when things slowed down. All of it had been scaffolding for whatever scheme he and Mark were running. The medical form wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was how easily he had been willing to use my health, real or invented as a weapon against me the second I stopped being useful. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. Another text from my husband. This one was shorter and meaner than the rest. Mark says you're dragging HR into it now. Cute. You really want to play this game? Fine. We have more than enough to show everyone exactly how unstable you've gotten. Last chance to sign and disappear quietly. I didn't answer. I screenshotted it, sent it to Thomas, and then blocked the number. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. The next morning, I met Thomas at his office with a fresh stack of printouts. He had already brought in someone new, a quiet man named Brian Torres, who specialized in tracing digital financial trails. Brian didn't smile or offer small talk. He just took the statements and the loan documents and said he would have a preliminary report by the end of the week. Thomas told me to go home, stay off social media, and let them work. You've done the hardest part, he said. You stopped pretending it wasn't happening. I left his office feeling like I had been holding my breath for days and finally let a little air in. It didn't last. When I got back to Megan's, there was a car I didn't recognize parked out front. My husband was leaning against it, arms crossed, wearing the same cold smile from the kitchen. Mark stood next to him, looking almost bored, like this was just another business meeting that had run long. They had come together. That detail landed harder than I expected. My husband pushed off the car when he saw me. We need to talk, he said. Now, before you do anything else stupid that hurts all of us, Mark added in that same casual tone he used in the emails. Ryan's being generous. Most guys wouldn't even give you this chance after you went running to lawyers and HR. I stopped 10 feet away. My voice came out steadier than I felt. You don't get to show up here with your coworker and call it generous. You falsified medical records in my name. You used our joint accounts to fund whatever this is. And now you're threatening my job. There is no talk left. My husband's smile didn't move, but his eyes went flat. You always did like to make things dramatic. Sign the papers we sent, take the small payout we're offering, or we start making sure every single person in your life knows exactly how paranoid and difficult you've become. Your choice. Mark checked his watch like he had somewhere better to be. Clock's ticking, Jessica. Ryan's being more patient than I would be. I looked at both of them standing there like they owned the sidewalk and realized something cold and final. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to intimidate me into silence one last time. And they had brought an audience of one each other to make sure I understood how outnumbered I was supposed to feel. I didn't answer. I turned around, walked past them into Megan's building, and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the sharp, bitter certainty that the man I had married had just shown me exactly who he was willing to become when I stopped playing along. Upstairs, Megan took one look at my face and asked what happened. I told her. She listened without interrupting, then said the only thing that made sense in that moment. You're not going back there alone. And you're not signing anything until Thomas says it's safe. I nodded. For the first time since the email started, I let myself feel the full weight of what I was about to do. I was going to burn the marriage down. I was going to drag every falsified document and every threatening message into the light. And I was going to make sure neither my husband nor his coworker could ever use my name or my life as collateral again. My phone buzzed on the counter. A new text from an unknown number. I almost didn't open it. When I did, the message was simple and vicious. Last warning. Sign or we make sure you regret not disappearing quietly. I stared at the screen until the words stopped moving. Then I forwarded it to Thomas and Brian Torres with one line of my own. They just made this easier. The war had started, and for the first time, I wasn't the only one holding the evidence. The next day, I met Thomas, Brian Torres, and Megan at the lawyer's office. Karen Ellis joined by video call from her car on her lunch break because she refused to let me face any more of it alone. Brian had already traced every transfer. The numbers were ugly and precise. Over the past 18 months, my husband and Mark had moved enough money through our joint accounts and the falsified loan to fund a side business that was never meant to include me. The medical form had been altered by someone with access to basic records Mark's doing, according to the digital trail. They had used my name and a fabricated health issue to secure extra borrowing power, then planned to weaponize the same paperwork against me if I pushed back. Thomas laid out the options without sugarcoating. A protective order was immediate. A civil suit for identity theft and fraud was possible. Criminal referral to the FBI was on the table because the wire transfers crossed state lines when they moved funds for consulting. He asked what I actually wanted. I told him the truth. I wanted them to stop. I wanted my name back, and I wanted to walk away without letting them turn me into the villain in my own life. We drafted everything that afternoon. The demand letter was clinical and merciless. It listed every falsified document, every threatening message, every unauthorized transfer. It gave them 72 hours to cease all contact and agree to a clean separation with no further claims on joint assets. If they refused, we would file the protective order and the civil case before the end of the week. Brian added his report as an attachment. Karen offered to be a witness to the workplace harassment. Megan just sat beside me and held my hand when my voice started to shake. I signed the papers with steady fingers, even though my chest felt like it was caving in. The sarcastic voice in my head kept repeating the same bitter line. Of course, he thought I would keep quiet. That was the whole plan. The part of me that still remembered every promise he had made about our future wanted to scream. I didn't. I initialed every page and handed the stack back to Thomas. Then I went back to Megan's apartment and finally let myself fall apart. I cried until my throat hurt and my eyes swelled shut. Not pretty tears, ugly, gasping sobs that came from the place where I had kept every "will be fine once this deal closes" and every "trust me on this one." I had believed him. I had signed the documents. I had defended him when friends asked why we never seemed to get ahead. And the whole time, he and his coworker had been building an exit ramp that left me holding the debt and the damaged credit and the fake medical history. The promised future had never existed. It was just a story they told to keep me compliant while they used me up. The 72 hours passed in a blur of phone calls I didn't answer and texts I blocked the second they arrived. On the third day, Thomas called. My husband's lawyer had responded. They wanted a meeting, neutral location. No mark this time. Apparently, even his own attorney thought that was a bad look. I agreed only because Thomas said it would be recorded and I wouldn't be alone. We met in a conference room at Thomas's office. My husband sat across the table, looking smaller than I remembered, his lawyer on one side and a stack of papers on the other. He tried the same cold smile when I walked in. It didn't land. I kept my face blank and let Thomas do the talking. The demand letter sat in the middle of the table like a live grenade. Thomas walked through it point by point: the falsified medical form, the unauthorized transfers, the emails threatening my job, the coordinated attempt to paint me as unstable. My husband's lawyer tried to frame it as a misunderstanding between spouses. Thomas cut him off with the forensic report. Brian's numbers didn't lie. Neither did the timestamps on the emails Mark had sent from his work account. My husband finally spoke. His voice was the same one from the kitchen that first night, laced with that familiar sarcasm. You're really going to burn everything down over a few business decisions? We were trying to build something. You just couldn't handle not being in control. I looked at him for a long moment. The heartbreak was still there, raw and sharp, but it had stopped controlling me. You used my name to borrow money I didn't agree to. You let your coworker alter medical records so you could qualify for more. And when I found out, you tried to get me fired and make me look crazy. That wasn't building something. That was destroying me so you could walk away clean. He opened his mouth like he was going to argue. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. The room stayed quiet long enough for the truth to settle between us. He wasn't going to win this one. Not with evidence, not with threats, not with Mark standing beside him pretending this was just business. Thomas slid the protective order across the table. Sign the agreement. No contact. No further claims. The civil case stays on hold as long as you comply. One violation, and we file everything. My husband stared at the papers. For the first time since this started, the sarcastic mask slipped. He looked tired, cornered. He signed without another word. His lawyer collected the copies and they left. I stayed seated until the door closed behind them. The silence after they were gone felt heavier than any fight we had ever had. Megan was waiting in the lobby. She didn't ask what happened. She just handed me a bottle of water and walked me to my car. I drove back to her apartment in a daze. The emotional breakdown I'd been holding at bay for days finally hit full force once the door was locked. I sat on the couch and shook until my teeth chattered. Not because I missed him, because I had finally seen how little I had mattered to someone I had trusted with my entire future. The isolation settled in like a second skin. No husband, no shared plans, Just me, a stack of legal documents, and the slow, bitter understanding that I had been alone in the marriage long before I walked out. Thomas called 2 days later. The protective order was granted. The bank had flagged the loan after Linda Shaw's report, and the falsified medical information was under review. My credit would take time to repair, but the immediate threat was gone. He asked how I was holding up. I told him the truth. I felt raw and empty and strangely lighter at the same time. He said that was normal. Then he reminded me that choosing myself didn't mean the pain disappeared overnight. It just meant I stopped letting them add to it. I stayed with Megan for another week while I found a small apartment across town. Karen helped me move the few boxes I had taken from the townhouse. We didn't talk much. She just showed up with coffee and stayed until the last box was unpacked. On the first night in the new place, I sat on the floor surrounded by cardboard and let myself feel the full weight of what I had lost. The marriage, the version of myself that had believed the promises, the future I had been stupid enough to plan around someone who saw me as an asset instead of a person. The sarcastic voice in my head tried to call me dramatic. The bitter part of me wanted to list every way I'd been an idiot. I let both voices have their say, then I turned them off. Self respect wasn't loud, it was quiet and stubborn, and it didn't care if I felt lonely for a while. It only cared that I had stopped signing my name on documents that were never meant to protect me. Weeks passed. The protective order held. My husband's lawyer sent one final terse email confirming no further contact. Mark disappeared from the story entirely once the professional consequences started circling his own job. I went back to work. People still glanced at me sometimes, but Karen and a few others made it clear I wasn't alone in the office. The rumors faded because I showed up every day and did my job without drama. The medical flag on my record was removed after an investigation confirmed the form had been altered without my consent. I didn't get a big payout. I didn't get an apology. I didn't get the version of justice that makes for satisfying stories. What I got was quieter and harder my name, back on my own accounts, a small apartment that was mine, and the knowledge that I had chosen myself when it would have been easier to keep pretending everything was fine. Some nights, the isolation still hit hard. I would sit in the quiet and feel the absence of every plan we had made. Then I would remember the look on his face when he realized the evidence was real and I wasn't going to fold. That memory didn't fix the loneliness, but it made the loneliness feel like a price I had decided to pay instead of a punishment someone else had handed me. I still have the demand letter Thomas drafted. It sits in a folder on my laptop labeled Never Again. Sometimes I open it when the bitter voice starts whispering that I overreacted. The words are clinical and cold, and they remind me exactly why I walked away. Self respect isn't about winning, it's about refusing to keep losing pieces of yourself to people who were never going to value them. Thank you for listening to my story. If you were sitting where I was watching the person you trusted most try to rewrite your reality with falsified records and coordinated threats, would you have signed the papers to make it stop? Or would you have chosen yourself, even when it meant starting over completely alone?